The radar screen flickered with 13 blips converging on a single green dot over the Carpathian Mountains. In the NATO command bunker 300 miles away, Colonel Marcus Reeves stared at the display, his coffee growing cold in his trembling hand. The lone aircraft, callsign Raven 6, had been radio silent for 17 minutes. 17 minutes that felt like 17 hours. "Sir, we're losing her signal intermittently," Sergeant Williams reported, his voice cracking slightly. "Last transmission was unusual." Reeves had heard that final transmission. A woman's voice, steady despite the impossible odds. 13 bandits, Angels 20. They don't know who they're dealing with. Then static. The kind of static that usually preceded bad news and folded flags. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Raven 6 was flying a routine reconnaissance mission over neutral airspace, gathering intelligence on supposed troop movements. The MiG-29s had appeared from nowhere, climbing fast from a hidden airstrip that didn't exist on any map. Fulcrums, the pilots called them. Fast, deadly, and flown by some of the best pilots the former Soviet states could muster. "What's her fuel status?" Reeves asked, though he already knew the answer would complicate everything. "Critical, sir. Maybe 20 minutes of fight time, less if she's maneuvering hard." The mathematics were brutal. 13 against 1. No backup within 200 miles. A pilot whose identity remained classified even at his level, though rumors had circulated for months about the woman they called Raven. Some said she was former Navy, discharged under mysterious circumstances. Others whispered about a pilot who'd lost her squadron in a classified operation gone wrong, who flew now with a death wish disguised as duty. What none of them knew was that Captain Elena Vasquez had been waiting for this moment for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not this exact scenario, but something like it. Something that would let her prove that the shadow patch sewn discreetly on her aircraft's wing, a small black raven with silver eyes, meant more than the bureaucrats who tried to ground her could ever understand. High above the pine forests, Elena banked her F-16 Fighting Falcon hard left, feeling the G-forces press her into her ejection seat. The MiGs had formed a textbook intercept pattern, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed she would run. Instead, she was climbing, using the mountains and her aircraft's superior avionics to turn the trap into something else entirely. Her radio crackled to life, but she kept her finger off the transmit button. Let them wonder. Let them guess. The shadow patch on her wing caught the afternoon sunlight as she rolled inverted, and for a moment Elena smiled. They had no idea what was coming. The first MiG pilot to die would never see the Raven patch, but the last one would, and he would remember it for the rest of his very short life. Elena Vasquez had promises to keep and ghosts to put to rest. The mountains below seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the storm that was about to break across the sky. In the command bunker, Colonel Reeves watched his radar screen and prayed to whatever gods protected stubborn pilots with something to prove. The green dot suddenly accelerated, climbing toward the sun. Raven 6 had made her choice, and there would be no turning back from whatever came next. The war that wasn't supposed to be a war was about to claim its first casualties, and Alina Vasquez intended to choose which side would be doing the bleeding. Static filled the radio once more, then cleared to reveal that steady voice. "Control, this is Raven 6. Beginning engagement sequence. Time to show these boys how it's done." Alina's F-16 carved through the thin mountain air like a silver blade, its General Electric F-110 engine pushing her toward a confrontation that would either vindicate 3 years of doubt or end everything in a fireball visible from 3 countries. The MiG pilots had seen American fighters before, but they had never faced a pilot who flew like she had nothing left to lose, because that's exactly what she was. Behind her, streaking through the clouds like metal lightning, 13 Fulcrums adjusted their formation. They outnumbered her, outgunned her, and had her trapped in a box of mountains and sky. What they didn't have was her desperation, her anger, or the cold fury that had kept her awake for 1,000 nights, dreaming of redemption written in contrails and gunsmoke. The first missile lock tone began to sound in her headset. Alina smiled again, checking her weapon systems one final time. The Shadow Raven patch seemed to flutter in an impossible wind, as if eager to spread its wings and fly into legend or oblivion. She keyed her radio one last time. "Any MiG pilots listening on this frequency, you picked the wrong pilot on the wrong day. Raven 6 is cleaning house." The war that didn't exist was about to begin in earnest, high above a world that would never know how close it came to something much worse. Alina Vasquez pulled her stick back and climbed toward the sun, toward 13 enemies, and toward a destiny she'd been running from since the day her squadron died and left her alive to carry their memory. The mountains watched, the sky waited, and somewhere in the distance, the first shots of an undeclared war began to echo across the peaks like thunder that would never stop rolling. Colonel Marcus Reeves watched his radar screen transform from a tactical display into something resembling chaos theory made manifest. Raven 6's green blip had vanished into a cluster of converging red dots, then reappeared in a position that defied both logic and the known performance parameters of the F-16 Fighting Falcon. His communications officer, Sergeant Williams, was frantically adjusting frequencies, trying to maintain contact with their pilot, who seemed determined to rewrite the book on air-to-air combat. "Sir, I'm picking up multiple missile launches," Williams reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Both sides are going hot." Reeves nodded grimly. The politics of this engagement would be sorted out later, assuming anyone survived to do the sorting. Right now, he had one pilot against 13, flying solo over territory that 3 different nations claimed but none officially controlled. The perfect place for a war that couldn't officially happen. "Get me the Pentagon," he ordered. "They need to know we have a situation developing." But even as he spoke, Reeves found himself captivated by the tactical display. Raven 6 wasn't just surviving the initial engagement. She was somehow gaining altitude and speed, using the mountain terrain in ways that suggested an intimate knowledge of the area's wind patterns and thermal currents. Whoever this pilot was, she had studied this battleground long before today's mission. 300 miles north, Elena Vasquez rolled her F-16 into a diving turn that would have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft. Her heads-up display showed multiple threat warnings, but her hands remained steady on the controls. She had learned to fly in conditions that would ground commercial aviation, trained with pilots who treated gravity like a suggestion rather than a law. The MiG-29s were fast, but speed without wisdom was just expensive suicide. The first Fulcrum pilot to fire his R-73 missile had made a rookie mistake, launching from too far out and giving Elena time to deploy countermeasures. The infrared-seeking warhead lost its lock among the flares and chaff she dumped into the mountain air, exploding harmlessly against a granite cliff face 5 miles below. "Raven 6, this is Control," her radio crackled. "We show multiple bandits converging on your position. Recommend immediate egress to the south." Elena ignored the transmission. The south led to safety, but safety wasn't why she was here. The shadow patch on her wing caught the afternoon light as she banked hard right, using the sun to mask her approach on the trailing elements of the MiG formation. Her radar warning receiver screamed constantly now, but she had learned to hear the music in the chaos, to distinguish between immediate threats and distant possibilities. The second MiG pilot never saw the AIM-120 AMRAAM that Elena launched from 12 miles out. The advanced medium-range air-to-air missile guided itself through the thin air with deadly precision, its radar seeker locked onto the target's metal signature. The fulcrum disappeared in an orange fireball that painted the mountainside with shadows and light. "Splash 1," Elena reported calmly, as if she had just completed a training exercise rather than ending a human life. The clinical language of aerial combat masked the terrible arithmetic of war, but Elena had long since stopped counting the cost in anything other than tactical advantage. The remaining 12 MiGs adjusted their formation, spreading out to deny her the opportunity for another long-range kill. They were learning, adapting, showing the kind of professional competence that made them dangerous enemies rather than mere targets. Elena smiled grimly. Good. She preferred her fights challenging. Her fuel gauge showed 18 minutes of combat time remaining, but Alina knew she could stretch that to 25 if she managed her afterburner usage carefully. The mountains below offered thermal currents that could help conserve fuel, updrafts and downdrafts that could be ridden like invisible highways through the sky. She pulled back on her stick, climbing toward the sun once more. The MiGs followed, their pilots probably wondering why this lone American fighter refused to run from a fight she couldn't possibly win. They would understand soon enough. The shadow patch on Alina's wing seemed to grow darker as she prepared for the next phase of the engagement, as if the small black raven were spreading its wings to embrace whatever came next. She had been running from ghosts for 3 years. Today, finally, she would face them in the sky where they belonged. The radar warning receiver's tone changed pitch, indicating a new type of threat. The MiGs were getting clever, trying to bracket her with multiple simultaneous attacks. Alina's smile widened. Clever was good. Clever pilots lived long enough to learn from their mistakes. Unfortunately for them, Alina Vasquez had already made all her mistakes, and she had no intention of making any more. The lead MiG pilot, callsign Burkut-1, had flown combat missions over 3 different conflicts and had never encountered an American pilot who fought like this. The lone F-16 had just eliminated one of his wingmen with a long-range shot that suggested either exceptional luck or exceptional skill. Given the way the Fighting Falcon was now maneuvering through the mountain air, luck seemed an inadequate explanation. All Burkut flights maintain formation discipline, he radioed to his remaining 11 pilots. This one has teeth. Treat accordingly. Burkut-1 had studied American fighter tactics extensively, had flown against F-16s in exercises and simulations. The Fighting Falcon was a capable aircraft, but it was designed as a multi-role fighter, not a dedicated air superiority platform like his MiG-29. In a fair fight, his numerical advantage should have been overwhelming. The problem was that this American pilot seemed uninterested in fighting fairly. The F-16 had disappeared into a canyon between 2 peaks, using the terrain to break radar lock and force the MiGs to split their formation. It was a desperate tactic that could easily result in controlled flight into terrain, pilot error leading to sudden impact with immovable geology. Burkut-1 had seen overconfident pilots die that way, their aircraft becoming smoking craters decorating remote mountainsides. But when the F-16 emerged from the canyon, it came out behind 2 of his trailing aircraft, having somehow used the mountain geography to reverse their tactical positions. The American pilot's gunnery pass was textbook perfect. A 3-second burst from the M61A1 Vulcan cannon that turned Burkut-7 into falling debris and black smoke. Splash 2, came that calm female voice over the radio frequency they were all monitoring. 11 left. Who's next? Burkut One felt a chill that had nothing to do with the high-altitude air temperature. He had heard stories about American pilots who flew like they were already dead, who took risks that crossed the line from courage into insanity. Pilots who had lost everything they cared about and had nothing left but their aircraft and their anger. Burkut flights close formation and converge, he ordered. We end this quickly. Elena Vasquez watched the MiGs tighten their formation on her multifunction display, their pilots responding predictably to her provocations. She had studied their flight patterns during the initial engagement, cataloged their formation preferences and maneuvering characteristics. The lead pilot was good, probably their squadron commander, but he was thinking defensively, trying to minimize losses rather than maximize kills. She rolled inverted and pulled through a split-S maneuver that brought her diving toward the deck at nearly supersonic speed. The MiGs followed, their pilots struggling to maintain formation integrity while pursuing a target that seemed to view basic aerodynamics as merely suggestions. Elena's G-suit squeezed her legs and torso, helping her maintain consciousness as the forces of her maneuvering tried to drain blood from her brain. At 500 feet above the tree line, she pulled out of the dive and engaged her afterburner, accelerating in a shallow climb that took her racing across a valley floor dotted with small villages and forgotten farms. The MiGs spread out behind her, their pilots finally beginning to understand that they weren't chasing a fleeing enemy. They were being led into a carefully prepared killing ground. The valley narrowed ahead, funneling the pursuing aircraft into a natural choke point between two ridges. Elena checked her remaining armament: 4 AIM-120 AMRAAMs, 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders, and 500 rounds of 20 ammunition for her cannon. Against 11 enemies, she would need to make every shot count. She keyed her radio. Control Raven 6. Beginning Phase 2 of the engagement. If anyone's recording this, tell them the shadow patch means never forgotten. Behind her, 11 MiG-29s raced through the narrowing valley, their pilots finally realizing they weren't the hunters anymore. They were about to learn why Elena Vasquez had earned the callsign Raven, and why the small black bird on her wing had silver eyes that never stopped watching the sky for the return of the dead. The mountains seemed to lean inward, channeling the sound of jet engines into a roar that echoed from peak to peak like the voice of some ancient god of war. Elena Vasquez had chosen her battlefield well, and now she was going to defend it with everything she had learned in 3 years of flying alone with her ghosts. The shadow patch caught the late afternoon sunlight one more time as Elena banked into her attack run. Somewhere in the distance, thunder began to roll across the peaks, though there were no clouds in the crystal-clear mountain sky. Burkut One realized his tactical error just as Elena Vasquez began her demonstration of why underestimating American military pilots had historically proved fatal to foreign air forces. The valley that had seemed like a natural pursuit corridor was actually a carefully chosen engagement zone, with elevation changes and terrain features that favored a single defender who knew how to use them. The F-16 had climbed sharply as it exited the narrow section of the valley, using a ridge line to mask its presence before rolling into an attack position above the pursuing MiGs. Burkut 1 saw the American fighter silhouetted against the sky for a split second before two AIM-120 missiles streaked downward like mechanical lightning bolts. "Brake! Brake! Brake!" he shouted into his radio, but the warning came too late for Burkut 3 and Burkut 11. Both MiG-29s disappeared in twin fireballs that painted the valley walls with orange light and black smoke. The explosions echoed between the peaks like thunder that refused to fade. "Contact control, this is Raven 6. Elena's voice came over the frequency, still calm despite having just reduced the odds from 11 to 1 to 9 to 1. 4 down, 9 to go, still taking volunteers for early retirement. Burkut 1 had never heard such clinical confidence from a pilot in active combat. Most fighters, even experienced ones, showed some strain in their voice during high-stress engagements. This American woman sounded like she was conducting a training exercise, calling out her kills with the same emotional investment most pilots reserved for reporting fuel consumption or weather conditions. He pulled his MiG into a climbing turn, trying to gain altitude and tactical advantage over the F-16 that had somehow turned what should have been a simple interception into a systematic dismantling of his squadron. His remaining 8 pilots spread out in a defensive formation, no longer trying to overwhelm their target with numbers, but simply trying to survive long enough to coordinate an effective attack. "Burkut 1 to all flights," he transmitted. "This pilot has extensive knowledge of the terrain and our tactics. Recommend we climb to altitude and force a traditional engagement." Elena smiled as she monitored the MiG formation spreading out below her. The lead pilot was thinking now, adapting to the reality that his numerical advantage meant nothing if she could dictate the terms of engagement. She checked her fuel gauge. 12 minutes of combat time remaining, less if she continued to use afterburner extensively. Time to accelerate the timeline. She rolled inverted and dove toward the MiG formation, her F-16's radar painting multiple targets as she descended like a silver meteor through the mountain air. Her heads-up display showed optimal firing solutions developing on 2 of the trailing aircraft, their pilots too focused on maintaining formation discipline to notice the threat diving on them from above. The AIM-9X Sidewinder that Elena launched at Burkut 5 was a heat-seeking masterpiece of American military technology. The missile's infrared seeker, locked onto the MiG's engine exhaust signature, and guided itself through a series of impossibly tight turns before detonating its warhead less than 3 feet from the target aircraft's center of mass. Burkut 5 ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, transformed from a flying machine into scattered debris, falling toward the pine forests 3 miles below. His wingman, Burkut 6, had just enough time to register the explosion before Elena's second Sidewinder found his aircraft and added another fireball to the afternoon sky. 6 down, 7 to go, Elena reported, pulling out of her dive and climbing back toward the sun. Anyone else want to dance? Colonel Marcus Reeves stared at his tactical display in something approaching religious awe. The green dot representing Raven 6 had just eliminated half of the opposing force in less than 15 minutes of active combat. His communications center had gone silent, every operator and analyst watching the impossible engagement unfold in real time on their screens. "Sir," Sergeant Williams whispered, "should we vector additional support to her position?" Reeves considered the question. The nearest friendly aircraft were 200 miles away, too far to affect the outcome of this engagement. Besides, something told him that Raven 6 preferred to work alone. Whatever was happening over those mountains was personal, and additional support might only complicate whatever strategy she was implementing. "Negative," he replied. "Let her finish what she started." The green dot climbed steadily on his display, ascending toward a confrontation with 7 MiG-29s that should have been able to destroy any single American fighter through sheer numbers and firepower. Should have been. The mathematics of aerial combat were proving inadequate to explain what he was witnessing. Elena Vasquez leveled her F-16 at 28,000 feet, where the air was thin enough to favor her aircraft's superior high-altitude performance characteristics. Below her, the remaining 7 MiGs were climbing in formation, their pilots finally understanding that altitude would be crucial to survival in this engagement. She checked her weapons inventory. 2 AIM-120 AMRAAMs, 400 rounds of 20 cannon ammunition, and 10 minutes of fuel for high-intensity maneuvering. The mathematics were still challenging, but no longer impossible. 7 enemies with predictable tactics and formation discipline against 1 pilot who had stopped caring about survival 3 years ago. The shadow patch on her wing seemed to shimmer in the thin air, as if the small black raven were preparing to spread its wings one final time. Elena keyed her radio for what might be her last transmission of the engagement. "This is for Phoenix Squadron," she said quietly, speaking to ghosts only she could see. "Time to come home." Burkut 1 heard the transmission and felt something cold settle in his stomach. Phoenix Squadron. He had heard that designation before, in briefings about American units that had been destroyed in classified operations. If this pilot was connected to Phoenix Squadron, then she wasn't just fighting for territory or tactical advantage. She was fighting for revenge, which made her the most dangerous enemy of all. The 7 surviving MiG-29 pilots climbed toward 30,000 feet, their engines straining against the thin mountain air as they prepared for what their squadron leader increasingly recognized as their final engagement. Burkut 1 had been flying combat missions for 8 years, had faced American, NATO, and rebel pilots across 3 different theaters of operation. He had never encountered anyone who flew with the cold precision that characterized this lone F-16 pilot. "Burkut flights maintain tight formation," he radioed, watching his tactical display track the American fighter as it maneuvered for what appeared to be another high-speed attack run. "Concentrate fire on my mark. We end this with overwhelming firepower." The F-16 was diving again, using gravity to build speed as it descended toward the MiG formation like a raptor stooping on its prey. Burkut 1 calculated intercept angles and firing solutions, preparing to coordinate a missile barrage that would saturate the target area with enough ordnance to destroy any aircraft, no matter how skillfully flown. "Steady," he murmured to his pilots. "Wait for optimal range." Elena Vasquez had been waiting for this moment since the engagement began, the point where her remaining enemies would finally commit to a coordinated attack that would either destroy her or leave them vulnerable to the kind of close-range maneuvering that had been her specialty since her academy training days. The MiGs were flying in tight formation, presenting multiple targets within a concentrated area of sky. She armed her remaining 2 AIM-120 missiles and selected dual-target engagement mode. The advanced radar systems in her F-16 could guide both missiles simultaneously to different targets, though the timing would need to be perfect to prevent the surviving MiGs from scattering before she could engage them with her cannon. "Raven 6 to control," she transmitted, her voice still carrying that uncanny calm that had characterized her entire engagement. "Beginning final attack sequence. If this goes sideways, tell my sister I kept my promise." She triggered both missiles simultaneously, watching them streak away from her aircraft like twin spears of death and technology. The AMRAAMs separated after launch, their independent radar seekers acquiring different targets within the MiG formation. Advanced aerodynamics and high-explosive warheads combined with closure rates that exceeded Mach 4. Burkut 9 and Burkut 12 had no time to react before the American missiles found them. The dual explosions occurred within seconds of each other, creating overlapping fireballs that temporarily blinded the thermal imaging systems on the remaining 5 MiGs. 2 more of their squadron mates had been reduced to falling debris in the time it took to draw 3 breaths. 5 left, Elena announced, pulling out of her dive and engaging her afterburner for a climbing turn that brought her back toward the survivors. Her cannon's targeting system began tracking the nearest MiG, calculating lead angles and bullet trajectories with digital precision. Burkut 1 found himself facing an American pilot who had just reduced his 12-aircraft squadron to 5 survivors in less than 20 minutes of combat. The tactical situation had evolved from a routine interception to something resembling a demonstration of advanced air-to-air combat techniques. His remaining pilots were shaken, their formation discipline beginning to fracture under the pressure of watching their squadron mates die one by one. "All Burkut flights disengage and climb," he ordered, recognizing that tactical withdrawal was now the only rational option. "We regroup at altitude and call for reinforcements." Elena heard the transmission and smiled grimly. The MiG pilots were finally understanding that they had stumbled into something larger than a simple territorial dispute. This wasn't about airspace violations or reconnaissance missions. This was about 3 years of nightmares, 3 years of survivors' guilt, and 3 years of waiting for a chance to balance the scales of combat mathematics. She selected cannon mode and closed on the trailing MiG, her targeting system painting the enemy aircraft with invisible laser light, while calculating the complex geometry required to put 20 high-explosive rounds into a supersonic target. The M61, a one-Vulcan cannon, was a masterpiece of American military engineering, capable of firing 6,100 rounds per minute with devastating accuracy. Her 3-second burst caught Burkut 4 center of mass, the high-explosive rounds tearing through aluminum and steel with the efficiency of industrial machinery. The MiG's fuel tanks erupted in a fireball that briefly outshone the afternoon sun, sending burning wreckage spinning toward the forests below. "4 left," Elena reported, banking hard to avoid debris from her latest kill. "Anyone else feeling lucky today?" Colonel Reeves watched his tactical display with the focused attention of a man witnessing something that would be analyzed and discussed in military academies for decades. Raven 6 had just achieved an 8-to-1 kill ratio against experienced enemy pilots flying modern aircraft. The engagement was violating every principle of conventional air-to-air combat theory. "Sir," Sergeant Williams said quietly, "she's down to her last few minutes of combat fuel." Reeves nodded, understanding that the final phase of this engagement would determine whether his mysterious pilot became a legend or a cautionary tale about the dangers of tactical overconfidence. 4 MiG-29s remained, their pilots desperate and therefore dangerous. Desperate pilots took risks that could result in mutual destruction, Pyrrhic victories that left everyone dead. "Get me a direct channel to Raven 6, he ordered. "She needs to know her fuel status." Elena Vasquez was already aware of her fuel situation. 7 minutes of high-intensity maneuvering remained, less if the final 4 MiGs decided to make this a prolonged engagement. She checked her remaining ammunition. 300 rounds of cannon fire, no missiles, and 4 enemies who were finally beginning to understand that retreat was their only rational option. Unfortunately for them, Elena had positioned herself between the MiGs and their most likely escape routes. The mountains formed natural barriers that channeled air traffic through specific corridors, and she had spent 3 years studying these particular peaks and valleys. Geography was about to become her final tactical advantage. The shadow patch on her wing caught the afternoon light as she maneuvered for what would be either her final attack or her final flight. The small black raven with silver eyes had carried her this far. Now it would carry her home or carry her to wherever Phoenix Squadron was waiting. Elena keyed her radio one last time. "Control, this is Raven 6. Going dark for final engagement sequence. Tell my story if anyone lives to tell it." Then she switched off her radio and dove toward the 4 remaining MiGs, her F-16 screaming through the mountain air like an arrow shot by some ancient god of war and vengeance. The 4 surviving MiG pilots found themselves trapped in a tactical nightmare that violated every principle they had learned about air-to-air combat. The lone American fighter had positioned itself to cut off their retreat routes while maintaining altitude and energy advantage. Burkut 1 realized that his squadron had been systematically destroyed by a pilot who understood mountain flying better than anyone had any right to. "Break formation and scatter," he ordered desperately. "Individual evasion, rendezvous at Rally Point Bravo." Elena watched the MiGs split apart on her heads-up display, their pilots finally abandoning formation discipline in favor of individual survival instincts. She had been waiting for this moment, the point where coordinated resistance collapsed into every man for himself. Single targets were always easier than formations, especially when those targets were flying predictable escape routes through mountainous terrain she knew like her own heartbeat. She selected the MiG attempting to escape through the northern valley, a route that would take the enemy pilot between 2 peaks with limited maneuvering room. Her cannon's targeting system painted the fleeing aircraft as Elena dove to intercept, using gravity and her remaining fuel to build the speed necessary for a decisive engagement. Burkut 2 never saw the burst of cannon fire that ended his war. 20mm high-explosive rounds tracked across his aircraft's engine section, turning sophisticated Russian engineering into expanding gas and flying metal fragments. The MiG transformed from a flying machine into a ballistic projectile that impacted against a granite cliff face with spectacular violence. "3 left," Elena murmured to herself, banking toward the next target. Her fuel gauge showed 5 minutes of combat time remaining, but she had learned to fly on fumes and determination when necessary. The second MiG was attempting to escape through a canyon that Alina knew contained dangerous wind shear patterns that could slam an aircraft into solid rock without warning. She didn't need to fire a shot. The MiG pilot, focused on evading pursuit, flew directly into a mountain downdraft that drove his aircraft into the canyon wall at nearly 400 miles per hour. Elena watched the fireball bloom against the rocks and felt no satisfaction, only the cold arithmetic of aerial combat reducing itself to simple numbers. 2 enemies remained, and Alina had enough fuel for perhaps one more high-speed engagement before she would be forced to consider the unthinkable option of ejection over hostile territory. The mathematics were approaching their final solution, and Alina intended to see the equation balanced before she ran out of time or aviation fuel. Burkut-1 had watched 3 more of his pilots die in the space of 4 minutes, their aircraft transformed into burning wreckage by an American pilot who flew like she was personally acquainted with death itself. His remaining wingman, Burkut-8, was attempting to escape to the east, but the terrain channeled all escape routes through areas where the F-16 pilot seemed to anticipate every movement. Burkut-8 climbed to maximum altitude, he radioed. We force her to burn fuel catching us. Elena heard the transmission and smiled coldly. The MiG pilots were still thinking tactically, still believing that conventional flight procedures would save them from a pilot who had abandoned conventional thinking 3 years ago. She engaged her afterburner and climbed after them, watching her fuel gauge drop toward critical levels. 4 minutes of combat time remaining, 2 enemies, and somewhere high above the mountains, the ghost of Phoenix Squadron waited to see if their surviving pilot would finally join them or finally avenge them. The shadow patch on Alina's wing seemed to grow darker as she climbed toward the fleeing MiGs, as if the small black raven were spreading its wings to embrace whatever ending awaited them all in the thin air above the peaks. Alina had made her choice 3 years ago when she survived, and her squadron didn't. Now, she was going to finish what that long-ago mission had started. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission from control, but Alina ignored it. Whatever Colonel Reeves wanted to tell her could wait until the mathematics were balanced and the ghosts were finally at rest. She had promises to keep and debts to pay, and both required the complete attention of a pilot who had learned to fly with death as her constant wingman. The 2 surviving MiGs climbed desperately toward the thin air at 35,000 feet, their pilots burning fuel and altitude in a futile attempt to escape an enemy who seemed to possess unlimited endurance and supernatural skill. Elena followed them upward, her own fuel situation approaching critical levels, but her determination burning hotter than any afterburner. At 37,000 feet, the air was thin enough that aircraft performance began to degrade significantly. Engines produced less thrust, control surfaces became less effective, and pilot oxygen systems struggled to maintain adequate blood saturation levels. Alina had trained extensively for high-altitude combat, had learned to function effectively in conditions that would incapacitate most pilots. The MiGs were struggling now, their pilots unfamiliar with the specific challenges of combat flying at extreme altitude. Alina could see their formation beginning to waver as their aircraft approached their operational ceiling. She had perhaps 2 minutes of fuel remaining for high-intensity maneuvering, but 2 minutes would be more than sufficient for what came next. She armed her cannon and selected the trailing MiG, Burkhardt, as her primary target. The young pilot was flying erratically, probably suffering from mild hypoxia despite his oxygen equipment. At this altitude, even small mistakes became fatal very quickly. Alina's cannon burst lasted exactly 2.3 seconds, long enough to put 47 rounds of high-explosive ammunition into Burkhardt's engine section. The MiG-29 didn't explode dramatically like its predecessors. Instead, it simply ceased to be a flying machine and became a collection of metal parts falling toward the earth 37,000 feet below. "One left," Alina announced to the empty sky. Burkhardt 1 found himself alone at 38,000 feet, the last survivor of a 12-aircraft squadron that had been systematically destroyed by a single American pilot whose identity he still didn't know. His tactical display showed the F-16 climbing toward him despite fuel levels that should have forced the enemy pilot to disengage minutes ago. "American pilot," he transmitted on the international emergency frequency, "you have proven your point. I request permission to withdraw from the engagement zone." Alina heard the transmission and considered her response. Her fuel gauge showed 90 seconds of combat time remaining, perhaps 2 minutes if she managed her engine settings perfectly. The last MiG pilot sounded young, probably not much older than the members of Phoenix Squadron had been when they died in a classified operation that officially never happened. But Phoenix Squadron was dead, and their ghosts deserved better than mercy extended to the enemy who had survived when they hadn't. Alina keyed her radio for one final transmission. "Negative, Burkhardt 1. This dance isn't over until the music stops." She engaged her afterburner for the last time, feeling the familiar pressure as her F-16 accelerated toward the lone surviving MiG. Her cannon's targeting system painted the enemy aircraft with invisible laser light, while calculating firing solutions that would end this engagement once and for all. 60 seconds of fuel remaining. One enemy. And high above the mountains where Phoenix Squadron had died, Alina Vasquez prepared to balance the scales of war with precision, dedication, and the cold fury of a pilot who had learned to fly with ghosts as her constant companions. The shadow patch on her wing caught the high-altitude sunlight one final time, and for a moment, Alina could swear she saw not one black raven but 12, flying in perfect formation toward whatever waited beyond the edge of the sky. At 39,000 feet above the Carpathian Mountains, where the air was so thin that breathing became a conscious effort, and the slightest mistake meant death, Alina Vasquez closed on the last surviving MiG with the patience of someone who had already died once and wasn't particularly concerned about doing it again. Her fuel gauge showed 45 seconds of high-intensity maneuvering remaining, but 45 seconds was a lifetime in aerial combat when measured by a pilot who had learned to compress eternity into moments of perfect violence. Burkut 1 had exhausted his tactical options. His aircraft was approaching its absolute operational ceiling. His oxygen system was struggling to maintain adequate flow, and the American pilot pursuing him showed no signs of the fuel starvation that should have ended this engagement minutes ago. He had one final gambit, a diving turn toward the deck that might force his pursuer to burn her remaining fuel in a futile chase toward terrain that would kill them both.